Hey, what's up, guys? You're now listening to Devo with Uncle Theo. Today is day 105, and we're going to cover 2 Samuel chapters 12 and 13. Last time we left off with the sin of David and Bathsheba, and David was doing a lot of sending, and he was doing a lot of sinning. But the chapter ends by saying what he had done was evil in the sight of the Lord. And we pick up here today in chapter 12 where it says, Then the Lord sent Nathan to David, and he came to him and said, There were 2 men in one city, the one rich and the other poor. The rich man had a great many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb, which he bought and nourished. And it grew up together with him and his children. It would eat his bread and drink his cup and lie in his bosom. It was like a daughter to him. Now a traveler came to the rich man, and he was unwilling to take from his own flock or his own herd to prepare for the who had come to him. Rather, he took the poor man's ewe lamb and prepared it for the man who came in. And it says here in verse 5, Then David's anger burned greatly against the man, and he said to Nathan, As the Lord lives, surely the man who has done this deserves to die. He must make restitution for the lamb fourfold, because he did this thing and had no compassion. And we get the famous statement in verse 7. Nathan then said to David, You are the man, or thou art the man, as we are used to hearing it in King James translations. And because of this sin, look at what happens here. You remember the curses of Saul? When he disobeyed, David is going to receive curses as well from his disobedience. Look at verse 10. It says, Now therefore the sword shall never depart from your house, because you have despised me and have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. And so basically what's about to happen here is that unity that we've seen. Remember those 3 things: military, peace, building the temple, and unity. David is about to start losing that unity and the sins. And you know how God strikes with ironic retaliation. He took a woman. Now guess what his son is about to do in the very next chapter? Take one of his daughters. He murdered a man. One of his sons is about to murder another one of his sons. And I want you to see that theme of ironic retaliation on how the Lord strikes back, how you sinned against him. And David and their child from this adulterous affair does not get to live. It says in verse 15, Then the Lord struck the child that Uriah's widow bore to David, so that he was very sick. David therefore inquired of God for the child, and David fasted and went and laid all night on the ground. The elders of the household stood beside him in order to raise him up from the ground, but he was unwilling and would not eat food with them. And it happened on the 7th day that the child died. And the servants of David were afraid to tell him that the child was dead. For they said, Behold, while the child was still alive, we spoke to him, and he did not listen to our voice. How then can we tell him that the child is dead, since he might do himself harm? When David saw that his servants were whispering, David perceived that the child was dead. So David said to the servants, Is the child dead? And they said, He is dead. So David arose from the ground, washed, anointed himself, and changed his clothes. And he came into the house of the Lord and worshiped. And he came to his own house. And when he requested, they set food before him, and he ate. Now listen to this in verse 21. It says, Then the servant said to him, What is this thing you have done? While the child was alive, you fasted and wept. But when the child died, you arose and ate food. He said, While the child was still alive, I fasted and wept and said, Who knows, the Lord may be gracious to me, that the child may live. But now he has died, why shall I fast? Can I bring him back again? I will go to him, but he will not return to me. So there's a lot going on here. One thing that happens, you see his son dies on the 7th day, and that's a shot from God. He doesn't even allow his son to make it to the 8th day to be circumcised and to be considered a Jew. God is saying, I cut him off. He's not even one of my people. And also when we think about Psalm 51, if you go there and look at verse 16, remember the superscript is a part of scripture. And in the superscript, it says, For the choir director, a psalm of David, when Nathan the prophet came to him and he had gone into Bathsheba. So Psalm 51 gives you David's heart. regarding that time. And even in this psalm, you get to see David's repentance. But one of the statements he makes here that clues us in on what we were talking about in Leviticus, that there's no sacrifice for intentional sins. Look at what he says in verse 16. For you do not delight in sacrifice, otherwise I would give it. And so David knows that there is no sacrifice for this sin. He has to depend on the Lord's mercy. But he also teaches us something about prayer. He teaches us that while you're waiting on God to respond, you may have one posture, but when you get your answer, you can change your posture. And this has always helped me in times when I'm petitioning the Lord. And lastly, there's been a lot of debate about what happens to children when they die. And so some theologians have coined the term the age of accountability by saying that God protects and cares for all children who aren't able to have any understanding and they don't have the faculties to believe on the gospel. They say that God covers those children, and there's an age of accountability that we hit when we're accountable to God. And if you don't believe from that time on, now you can be sentenced to hell. And some people have gone as far as even to put an age on this. They say 13 is that age. And I track with them up until that point, because at that point you start to get legalistic. And so here is one of the reasons that doctrine is built. David makes this statement. He says, he will not come to me, but I'll go to him. And we learn a lot of theology from times we least expect it. And this is one. It reminds me of Philippians 2. We learn about Christ emptying himself and taking on the form of a bondservant. When we're just looking at a passage on humility, Paul just leaps into a new doctrine and helps our understanding. And this is what is said that happens here. We're talking about David's sin, and he leaps into the doctrine on the afterlife and what happens to children. And so many people think that in his mourning, that he's telling us that children are protected, they're cared for. So this, along with Christ's statement, do not prohibit the children from coming to me, because of such is the kingdom of heaven. When you start to piece these verses together, many people believe that children are cared for by the grace of God. And I lean in that direction too. I just don't go as far as putting an age of 13, because I know many 8-year-olds who have an accurate understanding of sin, an accurate understanding of the gospel. And so when you start to move with numbers, that's when you lose me personally. But even in this, verse 24, David comforted his wife Bathsheba. He went into her and lay with her, and she gave birth to a son, and they named him Solomon. So this is an important name. The seed is going to winnow down and move from David to Solomon. We don't know this yet. You'll see this later in 1 Kings. But let's pay attention to this and continue on. And the chapter ends with a war that Joab fights against the sons of Ammon. And we move into chapter 13, and we get the sin of Ammon and Tamar. And remember, God just said that the sword will not leave your house, and it happens in the very next chapter. It reminds me of Genesis 3, when God says there will be enmity between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. And boom, very next chapter, we get a murder. It jumps off. It's jumping off here too. You got two of David's children. One is named Ammon, and the other is Tamar. And Tamar is Absalom's sister. And Ammon just has this intense desire for her. It says in verse 1 that he loved her. In verse 2, it says that he was so frustrated because of his sister Tamar that he made himself ill. But one of his friends by the name of Jonadab in verse 3 comes to him and tells him how to get a hold of this sister. He says, lie in your bed and pretend to be ill, and just ask your father to allow her to come and bring you some food to eat. So he does this, and he ends up violating his sister. And she tells him, like, why are you doing this to me? Do not violate me, for such a thing is not done in Israel. Do not do this disgraceful thing. But the text in verse 14 says that he would not listen to her. And since he was stronger than her, he violated her and laid with her. But look at this. Immediately after he fulfills his pleasure, in verse 15 it says, then Ammon hated her with a very great hatred, and the hatred with which he hated her was greater than the love which he loved her. And I don't know any better verse to teach us about the deceptive power of lust, the mirage it creates, and the deceiving nature of sin once it's fulfilled. The love you thought you once had turns into hate immediately after you're gratified. And that's what happens here. And this narrative is one of the best case studies on the progression of sin. If you couple this with James, which tells us how sin is developed, first it's conceived, then it's fully grown, then it gives birth. This is a very clear, robust, potent picture of that. And we do well, especially my men, to study and master this verse because it'll show you the folly of sexual sin and the wickedness of pursuing your own lust. But he kicks her out of his room and she goes out crying and runs into Absalom and reports this to him. And he tells her, hey, don't worry about this. He minimizes it. And it says in verse 20 that she was desolate and he brings her into her house. King David heard about this and he was very angry. But Absalom did not speak to Amnon, neither good or bad. For Absalom hated Amnon because he had violated his sister Tamar. And I want you to see how hatred works. Absalom minimized this because he had a plot to kill Amnon, and he waited 2 full years to fulfill this plot. It says this in verse 23. And he comes up with a plot to go with sheep shearers and ask the king and his servants to go with him. But the king says, no, we should not go, for we will be burdensome to you. And then Absalom says, let's just let Amnon go. David didn't understand it at first, but he says, oh, just let him go. He goes, and Absalom commands his servant. He has a plot. He says, let's get Amnon drunk. Let's get his heart merry with wine, and then we'll strike him and put him to death. And that happens. And they go back and report this to David. First, they report a misinformation. They say that all your sons that went with Absalom were killed, and David grieves. But the accurate report comes by Jonadab in verse 32. He says, no, it was just Amnon that was killed. And so Absalom flees. He's on the run. And that's how our chapter ends. But what's happening here? Exactly what Nathan said would happen when God prophesied through him. The sword is now in his house, and he said it will never depart from your house. And that's what's going to happen. And it's going to even intensify after Solomon takes the throne. And due to Solomon's sin, that sword is going to divide the house. And we'll get 2 separate nations again, Judah and Israel. And that'll move us into learning about the kings. But we're on our way to biblical literacy. We're almost done. Can you believe it? A few more books and we'll be done with all historical narrative. I think we got the Kings, the Chronicles, Ezra and Nehemiah, and we're done. We'll be looking at the prophets and poetry and wisdom literature. Isn't that an amazing thing? And it's because of your faithfulness that has brought you here. You're now almost there with having biblical literacy on all the historical books. And next time you go through these books, you just build on the knowledge that you have and go deeper and deeper every year. And that's how you grow deep oak tree roots. Looking forward to seeing a lot of mighty oak trees face to face one day. You guys take care.